Let's try going into this blind. Let's start with the statements in sequence. A says translators are like bumblebees. B says, though long since scientifically disproved, this factoid is still routinely trotted out. So far, we don't have any connections here. There's a factoid being referred to in B. Now, some of this is, to an extent, it is dependent on what the meaning of the word factoid is. A factoid is close to a fact. It derives from the word fact, but it means something slightly different. A factoid is a common misconception, something which has been used so commonly, something which is false, but it has been used commonly so often that it has that people have started to consider it to be true. Such a thing is called a factoid, a common misconception. So this factoid is still routinely trotted out. Are we talking about what is mentioned in A? Translators are like bumblebees. Let's see about that. Let's look further. C states similar pronouncements about the impossibility of translation have dogged practitioners since Leonardo Bruni's The Interpretation Recta, published in 1424. In D, we have bees, unaware of these deliberations, have continued to flit from flower to flower, and translators continue to translate. Now, this is all over the place. We are talking about translation, scientifically disproved uh, bees. So we don't know where we are yet. Let's look at E. In 1934, the French entomologist Auguste Magnat pronounced the flight of the bumblebee to be aerodynamically impossible. Now, this gives us clarity. We realize now that it is statement B, which is the odd statement. Let's look at these once again. Let's skip B and look at the other statements. To an extent, in a sequence like this, translators are like bumblebees. This is the introduction, a very generalized statement, very short statement. This is the introduction. Then comes E, which goes into the specifics of bees in bumblebee. In 1934, the French entomologist Auguste Magnat pronounced the flight of the bumblebee to be aerodynamically impossible. So this person, who is an entomologist, is an expert in a certain field. We don't necessarily need to know the meaning of the word entomologist, don't worry. He pronounced that the flight of the bumblebee is aerodynamically impossible. Then we have statement C, similar pronouncements about the impossibility of translation. How do we connect this? Aerodynamically impossible, impossibility of translation. So impossible flight, impossibility of translation have dogged practitioners since Leonardo Bruni's this work, published in 1424. It's quite a mouthful, so I'm not repeating it again. You can as much as you wish to. D says, bees, unaware of these deliberations, have continued to flit from flower to flower, and translators continue to translate. So this is a very funny inversion of what is mentioned in E and C. It is something which connects with A, something which confirms A. So A says translators are like bumblebees. D says a very similar thing. But in between E and C, they present a different argument. In E, we have E and C actually build towards why the author says translators are like bumblebees. So E says that in 1934, this entomologist said that the bumblebee's flight is aerodynamically impossible. It's impossible for the bumblebee to fly. C tells us that similar pronouncements about the impossibility of translation have been troubling practitioners since 1424. Similar pronouncements that translation is impossible. So flight is impossible, translation is impossible. But then D, very interestingly and in a rather funny way, says, but nobody told the bees that their flight was impossible, so they continue to fly. And if someone told them, they would stop flying. But uh, the bees, they are unaware of these deliberations. They don't know that people are talking about their flight being impossible, and so they have continued to flit from flower to flower, and translators continue to translate. Perhaps nobody told the translators also that translation is impossible. Once we have a little chuckle to ourselves, seeing how the such an interesting and funny line presents the overall argument, we see B talking about, though long since scientifically disproved, this factoid is still routinely trotted out. Now think about it. Which of these statements could be called a scientific factoid? We cannot call a scientific factoid. This is a comparison, a simile. Translators are like bumblebees. Translators are not really bumblebees. So when the full moon rises, they won't turn into a bee and fly away into the night. So that's not the case. So we are not talking about scientific factoid in this statement. Similar pronouncements about the impossibility of translation. Again, the impossibility of translation is not a uh, scientific fact or factoid. D brings the conclusion. So, unaware of these deliberations, bees have continued to flit. Maybe this belongs to science. It also talks about translators. Maybe this does belong to science, but then bees have continued to flit from flower to flower. Flower. Bees go to flowers to collect nectar, and thus they also help in pollination. That's science for you. The more you know, all of that is actual true science. It's a fact, not a factoid. So it doesn't work at all. So the one thing that works is statement E. The French entomologist Auguste Magnan pronounced that the flight of the bumblebee to be aerodynamically impossible. Now, we get the sense from the rest of the statements. The key aspect is not at all whether this is a factoid, first off. Second off, is it disproved? Third off, is it still used? No. The author uses this in a sarcastic manner. The author says, so back in 1934, this French entomologist said that the bumblebee's flight was impossible, but bees don't know that. So bees, they have continued to fly from flower to flower, collecting nectar. So this, if at all this is a factoid, we are not sure, first off. Second off, if this is a factoid, then we don't have any reason to say that it has long since been scientifically disproved and it is still routinely trotted out. Third, that is not the key focus. The key focus is the author trying to make a funny pronouncement. The author says, someone said bees cannot fly, should not fly. Their flight is impossible. Similarly, people have said that translation is impossible, but bees don't know. So bees continue to fly, and translators continue to translate, probably because translators also don't know. In all of that, we are not trying to disprove anything, or we are not trying to draw the fact that whether it is used or not used. Is it still being used, this pronouncement that the flight of the bumblebee is aerodynamically impossible? Is it still being talked about? Who cares? The comparison is with translators. So although very close to the premise, but it misses the point of the premise. It is inside the context, but just outside the premise of the paragraph. So we have cleared A, C, D, and E. It is statement B which is different from the other statements. So our answer is B.